mejores y que todos queremos aprender todos de todos, ¿sí? Así que es una tremenda alegría que sigamos nuestras rutinas, ¿sí? Les quiero recordar que aquí tenemos el código QR para controlar las asistencias y it's a pleasure now to have with us Professor Nils Metzler-Nolte. He's quite a scientist, so it's a privilege to have you with us, Professor. Professor is a full professor at the University of Ruhr in Bochum. He will explain a little bit more geographically where we are in Germany, and is head of the Bioinorganic Chemical Laboratory. Am I right?
Mm-hmm. Sí.
He studied in Hamburg city town to Professor Nils. Then he moved to Freiburg. Then he got his PhD in München. So it's quite flexible and moving from cities to cities. So fantastic. And now he is in Bochum. So it's interesting that he's not only the editor of the Journal of Bioinorganic Chemistry, or Biological Inorganic Chemistry, but he was also an editor, or he was in the editorial board of the Dalton Transactions of Chemistry, or whatever, which is interesting. We know Dalton because, like me, I am color-sighted, so I recall John Dalton for other reasons. So you might explain us why this journal is called the Dalton. Is it related to the people who color-blinded or not? I don't know. So it's interesting. You will tell us some more about this. And Professor Nils is here because of the fondesit or the ANID of Dr. Michelle Muñoz, who stayed with Professor Nils in Bochum, in his laboratory in Bochum, because he's an expert in the chemistry of compounds which have rhenium or have ferrum, ferrocenes, and all of these interesting molecules which we enjoy and have intense biological activity in the bioassays of the lipoxygenase and cyclooxygenase. So it's a privilege to have you here, Professor. And I've been asked as a guest to our faculty before your seminar, you must sign our book of invited an important guest.
Okay.
So in Spanish, in English, in German, or in Russian, we need a little phrase of yours.
Okay. I did not know this was part of the deal. Michelle did not tell me.
There are many surprises in Chile, you see. Well, and Professor Nils, it's easier to call him Nils by his first name because the Metzler-Nolte kind of complicated. So he's the head editor of this journal of, as I told you, Journal of Biological Chemistry. So he's going to tell us all of the difficulties and all of the complications of publishing. And so his title is The Does and Does Not, the do's and do nots of the publishing in this journal. And so this is our opportunity to ask him to help us to publish in these journals. ¿Sí? Muy bien. Professor Nils speaks as much Spanish as all of us, so there is no problema. So you might give your seminar in español, professor.
Sí, claro.
Claro, you see, no problema. So wonderful. See, I want to let you know that we will have 3 extra seminars, the faculty seminars by professors, and with this we will close the second cycle of the 2025. So, Professor, you're very welcome.
Muchas gracias.
Sí, señor.
So, yeah, I would love to give this in Spanish, but my Spanish is really just very little, un poco solamente. Por eso prefiero hablar en inglés, si permites. when I was in contact with Michel and giving this course the last 2 days to the students, of course, I always also offered to maybe share my experience, not well as a scientist, but even more as an editor, because it's coming from both sides somehow, huh? Because we see a lot of submissions from various countries, not just Chile, but all over the world, also from Europe, where you think, this is good science and maybe a good paper, but the authors are not doing the best possible job in presenting their work, or in making sure it at least gets reviewed and then hopefully published. And over the many years, as you said, I worked for Dalton, I think for 8 years or so, and since 2000 to 2020 for JBIC, so it's a long time, a lot of experience. So I thought I'd just share some thoughts and sort of try to make you aware of some things that you can maybe hopefully incorporate in your work. And I will say it's personal. It is my opinion. Some of you may have a different opinion. That's perfectly okay. Of course, I have been on several editorial boards and in discussions and also in governing bodies and so on and so on. But anything I say is, of course, it's my personal view. And as I said, you may disagree, or if you want, you can share your experiences if it's different, or you have questions or comments or things like this. So feel totally free. Hola. Here we go. So this is the JBIC, the Journal of Biological Inorganic Chemistry. It's the official journal of a learned society, so it's the Society of Biological Inorganic Chemistry, and it's basically published with a collaboration in Springer Nature, so a big international publisher. You don't have to worry about all the aspects here. It's going up and down, like many journals. We get more submissions, less submissions, impact factor goes up, impact factor goes down. This is normal, but you don't have to worry about it. Just to give you a background. It is a relatively small journal. We publish about 100 articles or so, maybe even a bit less. Something like Dalton will publish 2,000 articles. So it's a much broader journal, of course, also much broader scope. Yeah? And this is one of the things that we will talk about. Voila. Here we go. Okay. We can keep this interactive. If you want to add or want to comment, just raise your hand or just shout. I don't want to give just a seminar, but I would also like to get some feedback. Why do we publish? Of course, when you ask the publisher, they want to advance science and they want to establish a scientific record. The reality is, you want to graduate. When you're a student, you want to graduate, or you want your promotion. When you're a young professor, or like me, you publish in order to get funding. Yeah? So the reasons for us are much more basic, I would say, than to all this big blah, 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 blah from the publishers. Yeah. And this, of course, also influences where we publish and which journal we choose. And of course, first of all, we think of reputation. Yeah, we all want to publish in JACS and Nature and so on. But of course, there are also other considerations. Like, you may think, well, maybe, it takes very, very long, for example, to get something published in JACS. Or already my study is really of small scope, yeah, so it will not fit into a big journal. Today, many people think about open access, at least in Europe. It's mandatory to publish in open access journals now in Europe. So there is a consideration, and this, all the publishers, like the ACS has introduced all these open access journals, like JACS AU, like Gold, or or I think it's Molecular Chemistry Gold, or whatever it's called. So the publishers are responding to this requirement. I don't know about Chile, whether open access is an issue in Chile, but it's becoming more and more prevalent. One thing that I like to mention is this fact here. You can publish with a society publisher, like ACS or Royal Society, or like a journal like JBIC, which is owned by a society, and of course it's published by Springer, but it's still a society journal, so we have the reputation of a scientific society behind you. We had a discussion yesterday with Fernando, who's sitting over there. We had a discussion about, commercial publishers like publishing MDPI and so on. This can also have advantages if you need to publish something or so, but in the long run, I'm not so sure whether this is the way that publishing should go. But you can have your opinion on it. It's perfectly okay. Okay, language is not a question anymore because everybody publishes in English anyway. I don't know, are there Chilean Spanish-speaking journals? No existen más, no? Likewise, in Germany, we don't have a German journal anymore, so has disappeared. Okay, but the journal you choose will influence the way you think about your paper when writing your paper. And the first thing is always good to think about the audience. If you have a broad scope journal, you want to make a bigger picture than if you publish anyway in a very narrow, let's say, photo macromolecular materials journal. Then your audience already are experts in this field, so you can present your story in a slightly different way. These are the things that sort of are obvious, like keep language simple, compare existing work, do your job in literature research. These last things here I cannot emphasize enough. I get quite a lot of articles, and as an editor, I look at every single article that is submitted. I open the file, I have a look at it, and I don't read it, all of it. I don't have to understand it, but you get a lot of practice looking at it. And I really, really can only recommend proofread your article before submission and use this spell and grammar check. When you work in Word, it underlines when you make mistakes, and look at this and correct it. And because it's so annoying when I get a manuscript where I see that it is carelessly prepared, because I invest time, the reviewers invest time, and they get very quickly angry if you don't invest the time to make the best possible manuscript. And I'm not talking about the science. I'm talking about, it also refers to numbering of figures. Sometimes you get like figure 1, figure 5, figure 7, figure 12, and what is happening. They're taking from a thesis, they're copied, and the author has not even cared to renumber like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I know how it is, I know how it originates, but it tells me that the author has really put in very little thought in the manuscript. So you will say, well, this is obvious, and I won't do it. But I can tell you, I see a lot of manuscript, a large percentage where I think, well, if you just take 1 more hour before submission, carefully go through the manuscript and just make sure it looks nice and everything is numbered consecutively, and so on and so on. Sometimes authors even get the author names wrong. We have corrections in the journal where the authors have to correct author names. So that means, didn't the authors at least read their own names? I mean, how can that be? How can you make mistakes in author names? But it happens, actually not so rarely. Okay. This is what everybody tells you when you are in a scientific writing workshops. Everybody says, tell a story. You have to tell a story in your work. And then the problem starts. What do you mean by telling a story? I would look at it from a different perspective. These are the typical parts of your paper: title, authorship, abstract, intro, and so on and so on. The one thing ideally you want to be clear in your head is, what is my main message? What is my main finding? What is the novelty of my paper or the advancement that I'm going to present? You should be able, ideally, to say this in 1, 2, 3 sentences, more or less. This will dictate your conclusion. This is what is in my conclusions. It's like this paper presents the novel synthesis of something or whatever. Once you have that, the introduction will form, I always say it's like a bracket. Introduction and conclusion form the bracket for the paper. So when you say, this paper presents the novel synthesis of blah, 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 of course, the introduction has to introduce why blah, blah, blah is important, and what other people have done to synthesize blah, 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 or where other people have failed and not been able to synthesize blah, blah, blah. So it's quite obvious, but quite often it's actually not the case. So when the finding is the novel synthesis of blah, 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 the introduction begins in, I don't know, Patagonia and tells you about Torres del Paine. Yeah? It's like, what does that have to do with your finding, your main finding? And this is what telling a story means, that you introduce things here and then you bring it up in the conclusion. And of course, you should do the background research and so on. You should also maybe tell what other people have done. But it's also a good idea to, think about what other people actually have not done or where the holes are or so. And it's also a good idea, for example, when you have examples in your introduction of related molecules, related to blah, blah, blah. It's a good idea if you use examples which come up again or which you want to discuss later. Like, so, okay, it's blah, blah, blah with a methyl group, but the problem with methyl group was such and such and such, right? So it's a good idea to bring up things which come again. Repetition is always good. Yeah? It reminds the reader. If you bring out something here that you never mention again, then why do you mention it? Why is it necessary? And oops, eventually the title, of course, reflects what your bracket here. Yeah. So what the main information is in here should also be reflected, of course, in the title. Okay, let's look at this in a bit more detail. The title and the abstract are really important because you know what is happening nowadays. People are not reading journals anymore. It used to be that you go to the library, you take a journal, you go through the pages, article by article, and you pick out what's interesting. Today, everybody sits on a computer and you do a search. Yeah, you Google or whatever, Google Scholar or other databases, you type in your keyword, article comes up. You see the title and maybe the beginning of the abstract. Or you go to Web of Science, you see the title, you click on it, you see the title and the abstract. So how much time do you spend on one article when you do a literature search? I mean, I would say within seconds, you decide, this is important, I need this article, or you say, no, it's not for me. Within seconds. And now think it's your paper, yeah? So you have to convince, within seconds, you have to convince the person who's doing the search on the web, this is important for you. How do you do that? Or this is not important. Maybe if it's not important, that's also okay. You help the person by identifying, no, this is not what I was looking for. Yeah? How do you do that? So you try to it should be easy to read, of course, and clearly show what your research is about and also emphasize why this is important. And of course, this is, it sounds easy, but I can tell you, and Michelle knows this already, I usually spend quite some time on optimizing what I think is optimizing the title and also in the abstract, like, refining the abstract and putting in, you want to put in maybe in the abstract some details, but not too many. You don't want to give away all your results, but it makes no sense when you say, we synthesized a new molecule and we have investigated the biological activity. What does that mean? Which kind of molecule and what kind of activity? But also, of course, you don't want to give we have synthesized, and then you give a free-lane chemical name. That's also not useful, yeah? Or when you say we have investigated biological activity, I typically say anti-cancer activity against 5 different cell lines. Then the reader knows enough, yeah? If they want to know which cell line, exactly how was the activity, how was the assay done, they have to look up the paper. Yeah? But they know, it's about anti-cancer, it's not anti-infective. Or it's not, whatever, neurological or so. Yeah? So it's, and everybody has their own style. I totally know this, and what I'm saying is my personal opinion. Everybody has their own style, but it's definitely worth spending time on this. If you have half hour left before submission, this is where your half hour should be invested. Yeah? Because obviously, this, when your paper, when you have let's say the other way around, when you have a bad title and a bad abstract, that means people will not find your paper in the first place with the search keywords. When they see it, they think, no, it's not interesting. They don't read it and they don't cite it. So you and your paper gets less cited. And of course, everybody wants to be cited a lot and seen and so on and recognized. Yeah? So it's basically in your own hands to optimize your presentation. Yeah? And I think few people I would say personally, you almost cannot underestimate or overestimate how important that is. No? Okay. Yeah. One word on the title. This is I took this from the colleagues from Dalton. There are some sort of rules how you design a title. Keep it short and straightforward, but informative. Use keywords that other people will use in their search. And of course, you should not use abbreviations like here. And it should not be too broad. This one here is too broad. Yeah, novel super. Again, this says nothing. Yeah, it sounds fancy somehow. Super amphibious something, but it doesn't tell you anything. You don't know what is in it and so on. So a good title would something be like this here. Repellent even to hot liquids. So apparently this is why this work is special. Yeah, repellent even to hot liquid. That indicates this is the novelty. This is the new advancement in this work. This is why this particular article is important. Okay. As I said, abstract and introduction. The abstract is a concise summary. Hypothesis, methods, finding, importance. Some journals will actually request that you put in, like, background, methods, findings, conclusion, is almost like subheadings in an abstract. Journals like Dalton or JACS or so don't actually do this. JBIC does not do it. Some people actually really make you write a very, very structured abstract. I think, for example, PNAS has that. It's a longer abstract, but they really want details, and they give you subheadings where you have to fill in whatever, like your methods was investigated by NMR or structural or biological investigations or whatever. Okay. And the introduction, as I said, it sets the scene. It says why your work is important, what is the background, why are we doing this anyway? And what I always point out and what is missing quite often is people tend to tell what has been done in the field. And I always ask what has not been done, where are the holes, Why is your study filling a need or a hole or a missing information? Yeah? And it's quite okay to say, like, A, B, and C have synthesized this already and found this and this and this. You can say, however, the methyl derivatives have never been synthesized. It's quite okay to actually say that. And then, of course, you say, well, in this paper, we present the synthesis of the methyl derivative. Yeah, I mean, sorry, this is a stupid example, but it's quite okay to point out and tell the reader what has not been done. I will say, I don't know, maybe I should flip forward on my own screen here. Yeah. Oops. Okay. Just one word on the introduction. It's quite okay to say where the holes are and which holes you are filling. There is one, I would say, almost mistake that I see quite often. Very often, a paper is derived from a thesis. Either it is a master thesis that turns into a paper, or it's a PhD thesis maybe, and this is turned into a paper. And I think by now, most of the times I can tell this, because of course, and you all know this, the introduction of a PhD thesis will be quite extensive. It usually starts, with the beginning of the Earth and, how elements were created and so on, and then slowly goes into where your actual topic is. A scientific paper is not like this. Everybody knows about the beginning of the Earth, right? You're not telling this in a scientific paper. And you can tell when you read a paper, I think you also, with a little bit of practice, you can tell how that paper was generated, whether it was like from a thesis. You take the introduction, maybe it's shortened a little bit, some abstracts were deleted or so, but you can still tell from the story, the way the story is told, whether it comes from a thesis or is specifically written for a paper. And I think it's needless to say, to emphasize that the abstract should be, or the introduction should be specifically written for the paper. And not, you can take the thesis as a basis, but my recommendation is to start again. Yeah? Mark the information which is maybe most important, and then start again writing. Yeah? Okay. if you have comments or you want to add something or so, feel free to. I'm talking a lot, but obviously I like talking, but if you want to add something, feel free. One word on good scientific practice, good publishing practice. Very sadly, we see more and more cases of retractions, of the publishers being worried about, bad scientific practice, bad publishing practice. Maybe not most, but many of the issues that come up are about authorship. Either people say, I should have been on this paper, but I'm not. What is wrong? Or this person is on the paper, but has actually not contributed. And when this is usually most of the time nobody notices and just goes. But if there is an internal issue in the department, there is a discussion, people are angry about each other, and then they start bringing it to the publishers, to the papers, and then it becomes a problem for A, the publisher, and B, everybody who's also on the paper. If you are a co-author on a paper which has an issue with bad scientific practice, it's bad for everybody on the paper, not just the main author and maybe the person that is concerned. So authorship is the most common cause for complaints and corrections and so on. I will talk about plagiarism a little bit in particular. Of course, you have to avoid plagiarism, but I will say a bit more about that, a bit more details. Also, it is recommended not to fragment your work. So let's say you have synthesized in your PhD, you have synthesized 10 new compounds. Some people publish one first, and then 3 more, and then the remaining 6 ones, is it right? Yeah. So like 3 papers. I can see why, because you have more papers. But typically, my view today is that it will be 3 papers, but maybe if you put it all together, you would have 1 paper with a bit more impact and a bit more visibility. And also for the readers, like we talked about database search and so on, it will be more convenient for the reader. And it's more likely that they're likely to cite your 1 paper, which is the complete story, then they maybe just find one of your 3 papers and maybe they cite the least meaningful one or whatever, So my recommendation is to avoid fragmentation, but I know this is an issue. Yeah? For example, in some countries, I don't know about this country, in some countries, PhD candidates need 2 or even 3 papers published before they can graduate. And then, of course, you have to split up the thesis in 3 papers. Yeah? And it's not because of the scientific record the journals want it, but because of the PhD guidelines. I know that is a problem. It's difficult to avoid, and I know where that comes from. Yeah, you want to instill the sense you have to publish more than maybe 1 paper, but I'm really hesitant about the... Yeah, you have a comment, go ahead.
There's also this problem in the recent times with AI being used in many papers.
Yeah.
They're taken down, so people would revise them.
Yes.
A very bad time revising.
Yeah. I will have a little bit on the use of artificial intelligence, large language models later, but yeah, it's a very good point, and it adds to this good scientific publishing practice. Let's go ahead. Okay, authorship I mentioned here. I think this should be like, who made a significant, the question is always a significant contribution, and of course, what is significant? Is measuring 1 NMR significant? Well, if it's the 1 experiment which shows some particular new properties, it could be that measuring 1 NMR is the crucial experiment for the paper, so probably the person who measured the NMR and helped you analyze it should be on the paper. Other people will say, well, it's a routine technique, we have so many things in our study, so this 1 NMR is really like, only a tiny contribution. It depends on you. There are no rules for this. But what is definitely good is this last one here. Keep talking to people, yeah? And keep talking to people, keep talking to potential co-authors if you don't intend to put them on the paper because you think like, look, you only measure this 1 NMR. Don't expect to be on the paper. It's good to talk to them beforehand. Maybe they will understand and say, yeah, you're actually right. I mean, I thought maybe, but yeah, you're probably right. If it's such a big paper and this is only like a little bit, it's okay. It's much better than later on say, well, why didn't you put me on this paper? And then you have a discussion. So it is not always a nice discussion, but I would really recommend it's useful and meaningful and necessary to do this ahead of time. And honestly, to my PI colleagues, it's a discussion that you have to do. Don't send your students to tell anybody that they will not be on the paper or so. It's something you have to do. It's our duty as PIs to determine who will be authors and who will not be authors and tell them. This is really something that you cannot delegate. I mean, a few duties that we really have to do ourselves. That's one of them. Authorship is, everybody who's on the paper takes responsibility for the work, but I think it's still the PI, the corresponding author, who coordinates all this and should really have control of it. One thing that is, the use of ORCIDs here, so these like identifiers, is highly recommended. Also, the use of institutional email addresses is highly recommended. Some journals will actually demand it. JBIC, for example, is a little bit more lenient. I should actually say our publisher allows a more lenient approach. So we have a lot of authorships with Gmail addresses, for example, Google email or web or whatever, It is a problem because sometimes these people are really difficult to identify and of course also later on to follow up. If there is an issue and you need to contact the authors, then these emails just disappear and people are not responding anymore and so on. That's really, it is really bad. Okay, here we have the crucial point that you mentioned. All authors take responsibility for the work, and of course, AI cannot take responsibility. Oh, gracias. So this is basically the rule that most publishers work on. So you can use AI, for example, to help revise the English, improve your English. Maybe if you have written a very long introduction, you say, I think it's too long. You can ask whatever, your favorite model, say, please shorten this introduction to 1 page or 1.5 page. You can do that. But I always recommend because you are the author, you have to go through it again, and you probably have to correct the text that came out in some places. Because AI, in my experience, they do a very good job, I will say. The English often is super, but as scientists, we sometimes use slightly different languages, And I think when you see you can do the experiment. You can write an introduction or take something from a thesis, say shorten it to 1 page, you read it, you say, it sounds good, but there will be some places where you thought, it's not quite how I would write. So that's why I'm saying, when you use it, please always make sure that you read it again, and you're very likely to correct in a few places, to correct the language a little bit. And of course you have to make sure that what is the shortened version is actually what you wanted to say. Sometimes it introduces a twist or emphasizes something that you don't want to emphasize, for example.
Hallucinations. Like hallucinations. It's very embarrassing, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but I was a reviewer on a PhD thesis, in German PhD thesis. The thesis was written in English. It was good, it was graded and went and everything's fine. And we always request a German summary. And I looked through the German summary and I thought, this is embarrassing, because what I felt has happened is that the author has taken the English, being a German author, has taken the English abstract, fed it into DeepL or some translator service, and then basically took what came out of it and copied it into a thesis. And she was probably under stress, time stress. Oh, I need to add this. It's like late in the night. I do it. But you read the German abstract, and this is from a German, and it was really not scientific. You say there were words, translations that are just not what the scientifically meaning of it. Like the trace of an NMR spectrum. The German translation of it, when you are not a scientist, is something different. So that was pretty embarrassing, I thought. And I told the candidate later and said, look, you cannot do this. This is totally embarrassing. When you submit, like in your CV to a company, it's totally embarrassing. Okay. So that is the use of AI here for things like this. Different publishers have different policies. Usually the publisher will used to request that you identify that you used help, for example, for improving the language. Springer Nature has recently modified their policies. They don't request this anymore because they think it's happening anyway so often. And so, you know, of course, you should not use AI to generate research ideas, for example, or to like fabricate, so to speak, results or something like this. I mean, that's unacceptable. That's obviously clear. Yeah? Help with modifying the language, improving the language, I think is happening quite often. My recommendation always is read it and correct it and like make sure it's really what you want to say in the words that you would use. I think that's the best advice I can give. And we all know that AI is becoming better and better and better. So, you know, it used to be very easy. I remember a few years ago, especially, you know, I have nothing against Chinese, but especially paper from China used to be very bad English because the nature of their grammar is so different. So the English from Chinese authors used to be terrible, really terrible. Such that we would actually sometimes send back the paper and say, please use a native language, and there were like language polishing services and things like this. Not because it needs to read nicely, but it's really almost impossible to understand what you want to say. So to the extent that the good science behind the language you could not detect because it was just not comprehensible. Nowadays we get, you know, polished papers from China, super language, and I know this is not from them. So, but it means you have to be careful whether what is in there is actually what they wanted to say. So, but this has definitely changed. So I can tell this now. If I get a paper from China, it's typically, you know, excellent English. And yeah, of course there are smart Chinese people who speak excellent English. I'm not saying that, but the large majority, I think, have used help. But okay. To be honest and to be fair to everybody, and this includes like me from Germany and any other like you from Chile, any non-English speaker, in some ways the smart use of AI to improve your English and remove obvious mistakes and so on has made the publishing world more equal. Because previously, of course, somebody from Britain or from the US would have an advantage over you and over me as well. Yeah, because my English is not a native speaker, yours is probably not a native speaker, but a native speaker can just express themselves a little bit more precise and, you know, a little bit more elegant maybe. So in that sense, the use of AI potentially can make the publishing world more even. If used smartly and if used, you know, with your brains. AI plus your brains is what you really need. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
I don't know whether you have different views on it, and I don't know who's using AI regularly or ChatGPT or so. I think there are now specific scientific related, you know, models and so on.
It's bigger.
It's
getting bigger.
Yeah, it's getting bigger. And it's also getting more targeted, you know. I know, like, ChatGPT used to be like more like literature, and now you can say to ChatGPT, please write this as if, you know, you are a chemist or an engineer or whatever. So the languages are tweaked also. Yeah, as I said, they're getting better and better and better.
A lot of the time when it gets totally better, when it gets to write the way you want it, it gets to write the steps you want it.
Yeah.
I think that's the way.
Yeah, as I said, like my recommendation is always because your name is on the paper and not ChatGPT's name. So you still have to read it and check it and say, this is really what I wanted to say. And of course, you know, you design what is in there. So for example, the flow of the story and the introduction of, you know, how do you lead up to your topic and how do you say this has been done, this has not been done, and so to prepare the reader, it's like a funnel, you know, you prepare the reader for your results. That is, of course, what you have to put in. I mean, ChatGPT can help you formulate this more elegantly, sure, but to, you know, the concept, that probably has to come from yourself, I think.
Creativity.
Yeah.
So not only a problem for the things they're publishing, also a problem for us students.
Yeah.
Fortunately, some people use it in a bad way. And the teachers, on the end, they think that we all use them, and they're just not doing responsibly. It should be done.
Yeah.
And for us, the students that try it and we don't use those, we are doing. I understand both sides of both pages of the coin, but unfortunately, we should be more responsible, more considerate in the way that we use AI.
Yeah.
It's just like my personal thoughts now.
I'm totally with you. I mean, one of the problems, it's developing so fast. Yeah. For example, to follow up with improving our curriculum, to adapt to include AI, you basically have to change it every year or every 2 years again. So like, NMR, of course, has made spectacular advances from its beginning to today, but, NMR is still NMR, and it's like, a spectrum is still a spectrum, and a triplet is a triplet, yeah? So once you understand it, you teach the concept, you can teach it in 10 years like this. For AI, it's different. In 10 years, AI will look different from today.
Yeah. And with British fiction, after all, it helps us study and so find things.
Yeah.
But I still believe, and
I still believe and I still think that we should be more responsible, not only as students, but as a society in the way that we use it, and even more in science, because we're trying to communicate things to help people, not to be like kind of, I don't know if this is the word, but it's to be like a bad example for everybody else, and that they think and disaccreditate us, and mostly to the investigators, and just that.
I think you're opening a discussion that is like we should continue over a beer tonight. It's a big topic. I agree with you. Everything you say is correct. It has many implications, including for society. Let me say one thing about the scientific record. So somebody mentioned, use of AI, maybe fabricated data and things like this. You can say, okay, this is bad for the journal, bad for the authors, if it comes out, okay, fine. But the bigger picture is if, let's say, a lot of people use, image generation for spectra, for whatever, TEM images, for example, or cell images or whatever. They use AI for creating text, they use whatever, tools for generating the references and so on and so on. And let's imagine there were many papers there. Maybe it's only 5% or 2% or 15 or whatever. Not everything, but a significant percentage. What does this do? It will discredit the credibility of science in general. Because people who do not trust science and who do not like science, and I don't need to mention name, but you know which kind of people I mean, they will use these bad examples, the 10% bad examples, to discredit all the other good work that you and I and everybody is doing. And that is dangerous for society in the long run. It's not just bad for me. I mean, I'm 58, I'm retired anyway in 10 years, so I can say I don't care. But it will damage the credibility of science and for future generation. And of course, those people will then shape policies again and so on. And if that is discredited, then we have a problem altogether.
Yeah, and I also have a question for you.
Okay.
And I was wondering which advice can you give as students to improve, like in the aspect of helping the teachers to publish, to make a good work and things like that? Like, which would be the advice? And also, how can we be like a really helpful hand for them to kind of relieve them from many stress that could be publishing and doing work while making classes, everything?
So it's a good question. I would say the colleagues, the senior colleagues in the audience, probably everybody has a different answer. So my way of approaching, students, for example, when they write a paper, we usually sit down together and discuss what should be in the paper and maybe what should not be in the paper, and maybe which spectrum we show, crystal structure, which data. And I usually ask the student to prepare a first draft. or quite often a report that the student has written is already the basis for first draft and so on. And then typically my way of operating is, and the same is true also for a PhD or even for postdocs when they write a paper. My way typically is I'm looking at it and I'm reading it and sitting down with the students to go through the paper and give my comments, suggestions. I don't necessarily expect that everything is right. Sometimes I misunderstand or, the student meant something different, okay. But anyway, we go through the paper and then they revise it. And if it comes to a decent stage, it can be like the first or second or third revision or whatever, the better the student, the faster. Then I usually ask for the file and everything, and I go through it one last time and then submit. So this is my responsibility as a lead author. I go through it one last time, I circulate it to all the authors, as you saw before, and then I submit. This would be my approach. I know also there are colleagues who comment on the student draft and give feedback and so on, and then they expect the student to submit the paper and do all the paperwork. It's a personal style. Don't ask me whether I like it or not, but it's a personal style. Every supervisor, every PI has their own style. I also know of colleagues who say to the student, okay, give me all your spectra, give me all your information, I write the paper. And the student never gets to write anything. Yeah? We have colleagues, I have very famous colleagues, I know, in the US, for example, who do work this way, because they say, I'm anyway much faster. I have written already 200 papers. I'm much faster writing a paper. I know what I want to say. Yeah? I know the field, I know the background, I know the references, I know why we did the study. Anyway, I'm the best, so I'm writing the paper.
Yeah, it's just that I mean it in the way not to be like to be stressful for the teachers, but to be helpful, to be able to collaborate with them in a way that they can feel comfortable as much as us, and just to be a helpful hand for them and to improve.
I would say it's communication. It's communication, as always, People will have different styles, also students are different, PIs are different, so just ask. Ask and say, can I be helpful? Honestly, sometimes when I'm really overworked and I have many other duties like the journal and so on, my students actually get impatient with me and angry with me because I'm the time, Michelle knows this, I'm sort of the delaying step. I'm the what do you say, like the rate determining step in a catalysis reaction is me. Yeah, and I feel bad about it because I know, Michelle needs the paper published for her grant applications and so on. So, and we talk about can she do anything to support and speed this up and so on. But it's communication. Okay? Okay. When are we supposed to finish? 20 minutes, 50 minutes or so? 15 minutes?
What did you want?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, 15 minutes. Okay. I promised to say a word on plagiarism. As I said, what is happening quite often, people take a thesis and copy and paste and so on. This is, of course, not direct plagiarism because it's like your thesis and your paper. But, of course, if you copy things from other papers also, then, of course, it becomes plagiarism very quickly. I have actually had experiences myself that in Germany, when you submit a thesis, my group typically writes a thesis in English, it's submitted to the library, and then it's made public, and so it goes into all the databases automatically. Yeah? And then we submit a paper later, and the publisher comes back to me and says, you have a problem with plagiarism because a large part of this section has already been published. And I say, well, okay, it's been published, why? I get shocked. And then I look at it, the report, and it says, oh, it's from the thesis of your student, who is the first author of the paper. And I say, okay, maybe we should have modified it, maybe we should have done a better job, but you can point this out, and we had to rewrite a little bit and anyway shorten it. So that's why I'm saying, you try to avoid reusing it. As I said, it's better to write your own introduction from the beginning, and that also avoids plagiarism. But of course, like in experimental section and references, and I think publishers are now better aware of it. So I was blamed for plagiarism in references. Yeah, because it's the field, it's the field, and you have to cite a certain number of publications, for example, for the methods you're using and so on. Of course, they come up all the time. But I think publishers are now better about this, and plagiarism really refers to the introduction, the conclusions, and the results section when you discuss your results. I mean, if there's plagiarism, serious plagiarism there, then you have a problem. Everybody has a problem. Okay. Yeah, generative AI, I think we already discussed a little bit, so I don't need to say much more on this. Most scientific journals, at least the decent journals, are members of the so-called Committee on Publication Ethics, called COPE, Committee on Publication Ethics, which sets guidelines for scientific publishers for use, for example, of generative AI, for use of plagiarism software and things like this. And just to warn you, I think nowadays almost all decent publishers use something like Authenticate or Crossref or so plagiarism software to check for it. Like, for example, every paper that is submitted to JBIC goes first through a technical check. I then get the paper as the editor to see does it fit for JBIC or not. And there is on the top right corner, there is an Authenticate check. And if there is a green tick, I know it passed. And if there is a red cross, I know I have to have a look. It could be that the paper, for example, has been already published in a depository, like a preprint server. Then, of course, it's kind of okay, because it's a preprint server, it will later be linked to the final paper, that's okay. But if it's, if there are serious issues of plagiarism, then it will be identified, and then that's a reason for immediate rejection. It won't go any further. I see it. Previously, the technical editor would actually reject the paper if there is a red cross, and we said no, because in such cases, like a preprint server, like a thesis, you need to have a scientist to look at it and say, this is okay or this is not okay. Nowadays, I get it, I have a look at it, I make a judgment. So publishers are improving, but it is checked. You can be guaranteed your paper will be checked. Okay. I won't talk about everything here, but I would like to spend 1 second on the cover letter, because that's something I think is maybe underestimated. The reason I'm saying is I'm seeing more and more cover letters that says "Dear Editor," which is totally fine, and basically then they copy the abstract in the cover letter, and that's not what you should do. That's really not what you should do. You should explain your work in, as I always say, plain language. And you can also be subjective. In the cover letter, that's quite okay. For example, when you're excited about your work because you found for the first time I have identified this intermediate species, and it took the students really like 2 years, but now we have the data on it and we got measurements. You can tell this, the editor. You can tell the editor why you are excited about this. And of course, it still has to be sort of scientific, but you can use like, we were excited to see such and such is perfectly okay, because it gives your paper a personal flavor, which normally the paper alone will not have, because it's very technical and very, objective. It should have a statement on the impact on the community. I mean, it depends, when it's a really small study, the impact on the community will not be so big. So there is no point in saying this will change the world, right? So you shouldn't say that. But if you think it is something that helps people, like a new essay, for example, or so, you can say that. It's quite okay. One thing that is obvious, but please make sure you address to the right editor and you address to the correct journal. I'm saying this because there is the Journal of Biological Inorganic Chemistry, but there is also the Journal of Inorganic Biochemistry, and sometimes we get papers that were, for example, let's say, rejected from Dalton transactions. So I'm getting the cover letter from the people who have not even bothered to change the address and the editor. So the letter starts to JBIC, cover letter to JBIC starts, "Dear Dalton team," and then I know immediately, okay, this paper has been submitted to Dalton and it was rejected from Dalton. That's why they're sending it to me. Guess what I'm thinking? Do I want the rubbish that Dalton didn't want? No. So very quickly I will say, well, probably I don't want this paper anyway. So it's totally subjective, I know, but this is what happens in a person, in a human, when they see something like this. So, make sure when your paper is rejected, you submit again, please, change the cover letter and make sure you don't forget. You do yourself a huge favor, it's like only seconds, but if you don't do it, there's good chances you go right to rejection. Okay. What else should we use the last minute for? This is the sort of typical manuscript life cycle. You submit, and then there's peer review and evaluation and so on, and then there is the decision in the end. Maybe I would like to, just to be clear about the roles of everybody in this game, what does an editor do and why do journals have editors and reviewers? The editor manages, of course, the peer review process, and this is very important, decides about the suitability, and this is what we call initial assessment. So when a paper comes to JBIC, Journal of Biological Inorganic Chemistry, and it has no metal in it, no relation to metals, it doesn't fit to our journal. So I see this, and I don't have to read the paper. I mean, I read the title, I read the abstract and say, well, this is about some natural product, organic compound, natural product, even if it's biological, by saying, oh, it doesn't fit to JBIC, so it's immediately rejected. This is what an editor does. Yeah? And when I see it fits into the journal in principle, I send it out for review. And I choose the reviewer, or one of my colleagues, but anyway, we choose the reviewers, and we manage the whole process. We also manage, if there's an author complaint in the end, it also comes to my desk, and I have to manage the complaint, of course. But this is like the editor is the central person in this whole game. And also, it's important to note that it's the author who makes the final decision about publication. And of course, ideally, the editor should ensure fairness and quality standards. And I know this is where the problem starts. Yeah, I guess all of you, the more senior colleagues, will always have papers. I had papers where I think the editor did not do a good job. He or she was not fair, for example. And then you can either decide to complain, or you have a pisco and say, okay, I'll send it somewhere else. I don't care. Yeah, and this is, of course, when, as I said, when I look at a paper first, and this is what I try to establish, and you can do this very quickly without really reading every single detail, but you look into it and say, does it in principle look plausible? Even if I'm not an expert, like, is the methods used what one should use when you establish anti-cancer activity? Are the assays anti-cancer assays? Things like this. Even if I don't read all the IC50 values, I can see is it plausible or not. I check for ethically sound, like are all the permissions there and things like this. This is, as I said, also done by an editorial assistant and so on. Is the research of broad interest? That, of course, depends on the journal. Like JACS will have other standards than JBIC in this case, or Dalton, for example. Yeah, so is it of broad interest to the journal, the scope of the journal? And like technically sound, this is what I mentioned in the beginning. If the quality of the figures, for example, is very poor, yeah, bad resolution, not well chosen, or too many figures, like every single UV spectrum is represented, 20 UV spectra in one paper, I say, well, this is not what you should do. So something like this, I can easily check myself. This is, I think, the last point I really want to make. The editor chooses reviewers, and of course, the reviewer should have the specialist knowledge, which I don't have. I can see, is the paper in principle okay, plausible, does it look reasonable? But I'm not a specialist, so I'm asking somebody who is a specialist and say, can you give me your opinion on it, and so on. And how do I choose reviewers? I know, like, when you're an author, you always think, this person or this person should or should not review my paper, or this was probably reviewed by this and this colleague, and so on. I mean, I look at things like, is my colleagues who review, are they reliable? Do they respond? Are their reports usually usable? Or do they always say, oh, this is excellent, should be published as is? It's not helpful. I mean, maybe I need a good review sometimes, but generally it's not helpful. And do they reply within a reasonable time? And here I have a request to all the colleagues who do reviewing. It's quite okay if you cannot do a review. That's perfectly fine. Everybody is overworked and we all have too many to do. But please, respond quickly. Tell the editor, I'm sorry, I cannot do this review. That's perfectly fine. Nobody will blame you for it. There's no blacklist for, rejected reviews or so, declined reviews. That doesn't exist. But it helps the editor, it helps me to say, Carolina is not available, I'll find somebody else. I'll ask Fernando instead, or somebody else, never mind. It really helps if I'm waiting for Carolina's response for 2 weeks, and then she says, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not available. And it delays the paper for 2 weeks, yeah? If she responds within a day, I pick somebody else, maybe in 2 weeks I already have a review. So please, when you cannot do it, it doesn't matter, it's perfectly fine. I'm totally okay with that, everybody is okay, but please respond quickly. That's the most important thing. Okay, the reviewers, of course, review the work, novelty, impact, correctness, blah, blah, blah. And then this is the important thing. The reviewers make recommendations. When they say publish as is or major revision or whatever, it's a recommendation. And the final decision rests with the editor or the associate editor. So they make the decision and they take the blame for it. Yeah? So for example, let's say I have a paper one which says minor revision and the other reviewer says should be rejected. And I look at both and I decide that the criticism from the reviewer who says should be rejected is so severe, and maybe the other reviewer has not seen this or has not noted this issue, I can make a decision, say I reject this paper even if the other reviewer says, it's okay, it can be published with maybe some minor revisions. I had cases when, the author comes back to me and says, well, but you have 2 conflicting reviews, one says up and one says down, you should ask a third reviewer. And I can say, well, look, if this reviewer, the criticism is so severe and the point that this reviewer makes is plausible to me, and even if I ask many more people, this will remain a critical point, then it's my decision to say, no, you have to fix this. And then I'm happy to send it out again. When you do it, we fix it, I'm happy to send it out again. Yeah? But it's the reviewer, it's the editor, and of course, as I said, I get the angry letter from the author. Yeah. And it always goes to me, it never goes on to the reviewers. Yeah? So when the angry letter comes, it sits on my desk and I have to deal with it. And I have to, maybe my wife has to deal with it sometimes. But so this is very, very important to notice. Also, when you have reviewers, for example, you think they did not review your paper fairly. Yeah? You can, of course, respond to the editor. Let's say there are points which either the reviewer misunderstood your paper or they criticized something which they should not have criticized. Sometimes, unfortunately, it should not happen, but sometimes there are also some personal things, For example, one of my very first paper, when I was a very junior researcher, I sent it to Angewandte. I was very proud of my work at the time. It's like, this is like changing the world and so on. And then I got a review report that basically said, some scientific things, but also said something along the lines, Metzler-Nolte is a very young researcher. He should publish like in normal journals first before sending something to Angewandte, something like this. And I thought this was outrageous, how can you write such a review? So I actually, at this time you pick up the phone, you actually talk to somebody, you don't write an email. I picked up the phone and spoke to the editor for Angewandte, and he looked at this and he apologized and said, I'm sorry, we should have never sent this on to you. This is not an acceptable comment from a reviewer. He apologized to me and said, please ignore this comment. But, I had seen it in the first place. So what you're learning is, he said, when you reply, please correct the scientific points in your paper, whatever was criticized, but please ignore this comment. This is something you should not comment on. So also when you reply to a reviewer comment, do not put in anything personal. Do not say, oh, this reviewer does not like me. I think it's such and such person. He or she does not like me. That's why they rejected my paper. No. That has nothing to do in a scientific comment. These are comments from colleagues, and you can just read it. Sort of killer mistakes, so to speak, incorrect citation of the own work or other related work, overselling the manuscript. This is something that this guy is a famous journal, also an editor, famous biochemist, sort of killer mistakes. And this is something that I can totally agree is very nicely put by this guy. So when you have a paper where you think, yeah, it's not great, but it's so-so, and should I recommend acceptance or should I recommend rejectance when you're reviewing? Or as an editor, you have one positive and one really negative and say, shall I ask a third person or shall I make a decision right away? If the paper is badly prepared, sloppily executed, as this guy says, what I said, like, missing citations, bad figures, things like this, then it's very easy for me as an editor to say, anyway, the technical quality is bad, so I better reject. Yeah? And this is where technical quality comes in again, what I mentioned at the beginning. It helps when, when it's sort of on the borderline, it helps when it's good, well done, nicely looking, no mistakes, no formal mistakes. It helps to push it to the good side. Or otherwise, it gives a reviewer or an editor an easy excuse to say, well, the reviews are so-so, and anyway, the technical quality is bad, so reject. And that's, of course, not what you want. Okay, I think we're more or less at the end. So, muchas gracias for staying here. Thank you for your comments also. And I hope it was helpful.
Very interesting, and thank you, because all your comments are not only applicable for the Journal of Biological and Inorganic Chemistry, but to any journal that we all submit. Yeah. So it's open for all three departments here.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, very interesting. Listen, only one comment. You did not mention this. At first, language was a limiting barrier for publication.
Yeah.
Now it's money, because we have to go to open access. The universities will not pay. Most of our funding sources, you can publish one or at best two, but if you have 3 papers in a year, there's no way to get it published because of costs. So what are editors doing? What the journals doing? Because publishing is expensive.
Yeah. This is I have to be careful because I agree with you, and I totally disagree, I disagree with my own publisher, like Springer Nature. I think they're also greedy, yeah? And when you look at it, Elsevier, the publisher, the big publishing house Elsevier, has been blamed in Germany big time for asking for insane increases, in subscription fees every year, like 8% and so on and so on. So Elsevier got a lot of pressure and things improved a little bit. To be honest, and I have compared this a while ago, the ACS was worse than
American
Elsevier.
Chemical Society?
The American Chemical Society was worse in their price increases in subscription fee than Elsevier. Yeah? So even a society publisher who should support science and so on was asking insane increases every year. And of course, when you're publishing with the ACS, and the money they make from the journal, and honestly they make a shitload of money from their journals, it goes into science education in the US. So, there are cities where the ACS supports, let's say, poor in like, I don't know, take whatever city you want. Take Chicago, some poor quarters in Chicago where there's like a school with black children. ACS puts money into there to help their science education, which is great. But why do we have to support Chicago? I mean, the US has a bloody government. They should do that. It's their job. It's not our job to buy their journals to help educate American kids, right? So I'm really, I don't really know what to say. I think that Springer Nature is a company on the stock market. So they have a responsibility for their shareholders. And of course, they need to make, every year, they need to make, I don't know, 10, 15, whatever % profit, yeah? So I don't know, and it has become, of course, publishing has become, it's more streamlined, everything is online. JBIC, for example, is not printed anymore. It's online, it has journals, it has journal issues online, but even I, as an editor, I don't get a printed journal anymore. I think some libraries still do, yeah, for purpose of storing it and so on, but otherwise everything is online nowadays. It's no paper printed, no journal shipped anymore. All these costs have disappeared. Why are they charging so much? I don't know. I'm sorry. And I think, I mean, it's a different issue, but the move to open access, at least for my department, I can say this, has made publishing more costly than before. So if I take the number of articles that we published in our department, something like 250, 300 per year, I multiply it with maybe $1,500 per article, it's like $500,000, and we used to pay $200,000 for subscription fees. Now we pay $500,000 for open access. It does not sound logical, and everybody thought open access will make it cheaper and more affordable. I don't think so.
Because these companies live from scientists and from what we produce. It was not this way 30 years ago. Something has gone wrong there. So, open up for questions. Sí,
por favor.
If you do it in Spanish, I'll translate. And he said he can take questions.
Sí.
I can do that in English, no problem.
Good.
I want to ask how important are the names when you try to publish? Let me tell you something that an advisor told me once, that the paper are made of 3 factors, or something like that. Your research, the story, like how do you present your research, and the name of the corresponding author. So, and he told me, which one do you think is more important? And he told me, well, the corresponding author. So that also can be true when you consider the reviewers, because I had an experience with Jax working for Carlin, Ken Carlin, I told you that before. We sent a paper to Jax, we got 3 reviewers, and 2 of them were quite positive, but 1 of them was very negative. And for that reviewer, particularly, the paper was rejected. So I don't know if the name of a reviewer can be relevant in order to accept or reject a paper. If one guy with a big name rejects a paper, that could be like a determinant point.
So I cannot talk for Jax, but I can talk for JBIC. 2 points. I know what you mean when about the author list. And sometimes I have cases where there is a list of authors from, let me pick a country, Nigeria, for example. Something where certainly, and so on. And then there is one name of a more or less famous, say, American colleague. Does it help the paper? I think usually not. Not for me anyway, because I look at the paper and sometimes I even think, I don't know how this name of the colleague got on the paper. Maybe they had a collaboration or some contact or whatever. But if the paper is not so good, I would say, well, why has the American, the more established colleague, let's say, and the more experienced colleague maybe, why has this person not helped the others to improve their paper? So it actually doesn't help. If the paper is decent, I would not look at it differently even if a Nobel Prize winner was on the author list. If the paper is decent, the paper is decent, and it goes on. About reviewers, I wouldn't say so much it's about the famous name. I would say more from an editor's point of view, I have a certain, over many years, I have a certain experience about the, the reliability, the accurateness of certain colleagues, And if I get a critical review from somebody who I really, who I respect very much, for being very accurate and very detailed in their work and in their reviews, to me that counts a lot. But it's not necessarily about the names. It's not necessarily the biggest names in our field. In fact, I would, globally, it's not true for everybody. And Ken Carlin, for example, is an example. He always does a good job as far as I'm concerned. But sometimes the biggest names in our field actually are just more sloppy and faster, and they will just write a short review because they probably have no time. Just write a short review and maybe pick 1 or 2 points and otherwise say, it should be published, it's okay. And it's typically more like, for example, the younger colleagues who are maybe even deeper into the field themselves and maybe deeper into the lab also themselves, who give the more detailed comments and might be, in this sense, might be, from my point of view, the more reliable or the more trustable reviewer. So I think I would largely disagree with this notion. I know this is something like colleagues in India tell me this a lot, and they say If we have a Western co-author from Europe, like Germany, or from the US, our papers get accepted more easily. Honestly, I don't know. It may depend on the journal also. One thing I will say, and this is definitely true also in my own experience, I have a subconscious feeling that even for me it's difficult to get something published in JACS, more difficult than if I were American, from an American institution. I think there is definitely a bias in JACS, and equally, people used to say this about angewandte Chemie. American colleagues would say to me, oh, it's so difficult for us to publish in angewandte Chemie, which is a German or European journal, because they don't like Americans. And as a reviewer, I mean, I review a lot for angewandte. I have never never made any point about nationality, whether it's China or US or whatever, or Germany, it doesn't matter to me. So I would say no, I disagree. But if enough colleagues tell you this, then maybe it is true in the end. But I don't know how that comes in.
Or it was true.
Maybe it was true, I don't know. Nowadays, all the journals try to be diverse on their editorial boards, on their editorial advisory board. The chief editor of Inorganic Chemistry, an ACS journal, is Steffi Dehne, who is a German colleague. So a German female colleague is the chief editor of an American inorganic chemistry journal. So there you are, diversity, international. They hope, of course, it helps to remove such bias, yeah? But I don't know, I mean, you may have your experiences and I cannot debate it. You may well be right, I don't know.
Listen, Nils, what happens with equipment?
Yeah.
Americans, I was training in the US, Americans are particularly finicky about using the last edition or the last source of this equipment. If you are not using that, the paper is rejected. Oh, your method is not good. No, that's so simple as that. One phrase.
That is
obsolete method.
Yeah, that is a problem. I would say I don't know about American journals so much, but yes, I agree. Let me give you an example from my journal, which is in the same direction. It's how I deal with it. The characterization of a compound is incomplete, and let's say carbon NMR are missing. Yeah, example like this. So it's not about like the latest, it's not a 500, 200, it's just missing. So, and I write back and say like, revision, you fix this and this as an editorial, and say, please make sure that you also record carbon 13 NMR spectra. Okay, fine. And then the author comes back and says, yeah, but in our department we have only one NMR and it is broken or it is used so much. I have no time, I get no time on the machine for carbon NMR. And I say personally, that is not a scientific reason. Yeah? Then you try and have to find a collaborator or have to find something. It cannot be an excuse for doing incomplete science if you don't have the possibilities. Now, I know this is a very difficult argument because in many parts of the world, the situation is like here, you have one NMR for many, many groups, not so much time, and so on, and so on, and so on. I know it's a difficult argument, but should we compromise the quality of science because of this? I don't think so, but I know it is a difficult argument. And certainly, I mean, I would not accept, if the paper, in my case, if the paper in general is valid, and let's say maybe the UV vis spectrometer is not the latest model, and I wouldn't mind, and nobody criticizes this in my experience. But people will ask for maybe additional data, and then the author comes back and says, we don't have this instrument. Then I have to make a judgment, is it really necessary, or is it nice to have, when you make a new compound, you can say, well, the carbon NMR is like essential, yeah. If it's like an additional measurement, or you can measure the kinetics by HPLC and by UV vis, and maybe also by fluorescence, and the reviewer asks for fluorescence, say, well, but the other two are good, so maybe it's not necessary. But yeah, it's particular for less well-developed countries. This is a big issue, and and it's maybe maybe somebody like me. I travel a lot. I give a lot of seminars in different places all over the world. Maybe you begin to develop a feeling of, let's say in Chile, it should be possible to get an NMR.
And maybe in, I don't know, Nepal, maybe they're not even in NMR instrument exist. I don't know. I have no papers from Nepal, but you can imagine, say, okay, some things are maybe just not possible in certain places, but yeah.
Excellent. More questions. Yeah,
Sí.
interesting. You
Yeah, go ahead.
captured our interest.
Yeah.
Well, I like to make two questions.
Okay.
Because I was wondering when you make a paper like vanguardistic, like you make the paper, you create it with the story and all that, but then I make so many questions about like, oh, why is this like this? Why this is not resolving? And I don't know if that counts like for a new paper or I integrate this in the one paper, like you said before. I know if I explain it right.
So that's a good question. I mean, I said in general, I would recommend to integrate more results into one paper, not fragment. On the other hand, it has to be, or it should be, ideally one concise story still. Yeah? So if you have 3 different classes of compounds and each class for a different investigation, then it is probably better to split it into 3 papers because it's different classes of compound, different type of study which you did with it. Yeah? Whether it's biological or something doesn't matter. So in that sense, it probably makes sense to split it and in order to have finally a concise story. And you are right, sometimes we have cases where we have an observation, but we don't understand it. Yeah? You measure something, it does not fit, but it is repeatable, it's reliable, it's there, then it's an open question. This is the scientific method. Like, you do something, you obtain a result, and it may not be, you cannot be able to explain it, but maybe somebody later on picks up your result or it fits to something else in somebody else's research and they say, okay, here I have an example and now we can explain it and put it together. So it is quite okay to have open questions. I will say you have better chances to have your paper accepted if it has a conclusion and not an open question in the end. Yeah? It would have to be a very special case where you have a paper say, we've done all these measurements and we end up with a lot of open questions and we want to publish this. Very often the reviewer will probably say, well, maybe do this and this and this, and then you can resolve your questions.
And the other question is more like, I can just...
Can I just ask a question? So, I mean, I know people want to go for lunch. We can continue this also in a small...
We have to teach at 1:30.
Yeah, okay. Well, maybe we can just continue this among us and then just say thank you to everybody else?
No, we need to thank you. Come on.
Okay. Okay, good. Gracias.
Next seminar, next Wednesday, we have Dr. Pizarro talking about this very interesting technique, the Neubauer technique for both power. Yeah, study German. For studying volcanic. So, thanks a lot for coming.
Yeah.